Greetings and salutations, loyal viewers of this channel. My name is Sean, and today we got to talk about what is going on in the presidential campaign, because as VP Kamala Harris is falling further and further in the polls, as key voting demographics become further and further out of reach for her, all of a sudden you're starting to see all these different various reports about staffers from the Biden campaign team, from Team Biden, lashing out against Kamala Harris and Kamala Harris's staffers attacking them. Now, I'm going to get into this with all of you guys. I'm going to parse through it. I'm going to explain to you in great detail how Kamala Harris and her staffers are actually clearly 100% in the wrong. But before I get into that, I want to say thank you to everybody who supports this channel via actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay.
And I also want to say that on Wednesday, October 23rd, I will be at the Sovereign House at 7 p.m. for a live debate, one of the Soho debate series, versus a person called Joshua Eagle. And this person will be making the argument against me that it is the libertarian position to vote for Kamala Harris in this presidential election. You're gonna want to tune in for that. Register with the link in the description of this video if you can be there in person, because I'd absolutely love to meet you guys. Now, let's get into the actual story. So to understand where we are, you need to understand really quickly how we got to this point in time. So before we're even gonna get into the coup against Joe Biden, I think it's important for you guys to understand that Joe Biden and his team never wanted Kamala Harris on the VP ticket at all whatsoever. In fact, it was widely reported that he was going to pick Elizabeth Warren for his VP nominee. And the reason why we know this is because apparently he offered her that position when he was thinking about running back in 2016 against Hillary Clinton, before he was bullied out by the Democratic Party elites. And if you'll recall, even though Joe Biden promised to put a black woman specifically on the Supreme Court, he only said that he wanted to have a woman as his VP, not a black woman, because he wasn't aiming in that direction. And if you'll recall, Kamala Harris launched one of the most cynical, disingenuous attacks on Joe Biden the entire election cycle, and that had to do with him supposedly being an evil white racist that would have prevented her from being able to go to school.
And I will say also that in this campaign, we've also heard, and I'm going to now direct this at Vice President Biden, I do not believe you are a racist. And I agree with you when you commit yourself to the importance of finding common ground. But I also believe, and it's personal, and I was actually it was hurtful to hear you talk about the reputations of two United States senators who built their reputations and career on the segregation of race in this country. And it was not only that, but you also worked with them to oppose busing. And, you know, there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools. And she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me. So I will tell you that on this subject, it cannot be an intellectual debate among Democrats. We have to take it seriously. We have to act swiftly.
So from the jump, there was a lot of bad blood between Kamala and Biden, and Kamala's team and Joe Biden's team. But we fast forward to May of 2020, Black Lives Matter riots ruining the entire country, and it became obvious that Joe Biden needed to pick a black person in order to fill the role of VP. And since he already promised to pick a woman, it then became a numbers game on who was the highest ranking black female person in the Democratic Party, and that turned out to be Kamala Harris. Now, I know some of you are going to point out that she's 50% Indian, probably around 25% black, but for the purposes of this conversation, that doesn't matter at all whatsoever. It just seemed obvious by all the different various advisors that Joe Biden needed to pick Kamala Harris just because he already dug himself a hole by promising a woman. And then we have the racial riots in that period of time, and Biden needed to signal that he stands with those rioters. That being said, even though it was obvious, it is also widely reported, and it's in the book Lucky, How Joe Biden Barely Won the Presidency, that Biden reviewed every single black politician that he could pick as an alternative to Harris about 3 or 4 times because he didn't want her as the VP pick. So then we fast forward to 2024. Biden has that disastrous debate. We all know what happened. We've all seen the highlights, and all of a sudden the media turns on Biden, the Obamas turn on Biden, Clinton team turns on Biden, and the donors turn on Biden. So Biden is forced via coup that Kamala Harris was actively involved in to step down from that position. And the reason why Kamala Harris was chosen as the replacement nominee in this coup was not because she was the best candidate or anything of the sort, but because Joe Biden had about $30 million in his campaign war chest, and the only person he could transfer the money to directly was Kamala Harris because she was already on the same ticket as him. So think about that. $30 million and not a single vote. In fact, they threw out 14 million votes is what determined who the candidate was for the Democratic Party in 2024. And despite the media propaganda campaign that followed for the next 6 weeks, I told you that this was obviously going to create problems for them going forward. Kamala Harris didn't do interviews. We all understand that. We have a lot of fun quotes in these articles about how she's a coward, a terrible candidate, and this was to be expected. But the fact that she wasn't doing interviews then magnified the future interviews that she did. And now that people have seen her because she was hiding for so long, they realize once again that they don't like her.
The environment is vital. Killmonger may have ruined and burned your field of heart-shaped herbs, but don't worry. I'm from California. I can repopulate that field with a bunch of different herbs. To the lovely people of Wakanda, I know you will make the right choice. And as always, Wakanda forever. Paid for by Kamala Harris.
So the question that you need to ask yourself is, if you're Kamala Harris and you failed in every possible way, you were never meant to be the vice president, you were never meant to be the Democratic nominee, and the campaign is falling apart due to your own actions, what do you do? And obviously the answer to that question is to blame the guy you initiated a coup against, and that of course is Joe Biden. And that brings us to this Axios article where the Kamala team is complaining so hard about Joe Biden. It is honestly the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard. So we have this headline that says Harris staffers blaming Biden administration from not helping her campaign. Quote, they're too much into their feelings. And it says Vice President Kamala Harris staffers are starting to blame the Joe Biden administration for not doing enough to help her presidential campaign, according to a new report, as the Democrat sinks in the polls with less than a month before the November 5th election. Now look, to be clear, Joe Biden's bad presidency is what is hurting the Democrats the most overall of anything. But the thing is, I don't feel very sympathetic for Kamala Harris in this regard because she's the vice president in this administration, and she was essentially a do-nothing vice president, and the things that she did do were absolutely horrible for the country. She voted on the most tie-breaking pieces of legislation as any VP in the modern history of the United States of America. So Biden's agenda that has failed this country so much is on her more than is typical for a vice presidential candidate. On top of that, one of the few assignments that she was actually given was to manage the border. And we all understand with the flood of illegal aliens in the United States of America that are being paroled at a higher rate under the Biden administration and higher in terms of overall numbers under Kamala as the border czar have been a disaster for this country. So she is attached to the two most unpopular aspects of the Biden administration. And for me, hearing them complain about how the Biden administration isn't helping her enough is ridiculous and absurd in every possible way. On top of that, if everything was going well, if everything was rolling in the Biden administration, she wouldn't be the candidate in the first place. So she's trying to say, oh, he's so bad, his administration's not helping me enough. But the thing is, she wouldn't be in that position but for the fact that his underperforming administration made him vulnerable to the coup that installed her into power. Again, this woman did not win a Democratic primary. She didn't get a single vote in 2024. They threw out 14 million votes for Joe Biden in order to install her, and now she's complaining about the administration that is the only one that created an opportunity for her to be the nominee, because she could have never won it outright. Now it says, despite the veneer of unity that Harris and President Biden have displayed after Biden was kicked out of the race, some of their staffers are reportedly butting heads behind the scenes. Privately, several members of Harris's team have feuded with Biden's White House staff, feeling that they aren't adequately prioritizing her election bid, while some within the president's orbit still feel raw over his ouster. Now remember, we are told time and time again that Joseph R. Biden put country first. He decided that he was going to step up and do the right thing, and that he was going to step down in this race just to hand it over to Kamala Harris because that's the right thing to do. But I've told you repeatedly that the man was forced out because it was so obvious. First of all, we have the reporting that the Obama team, big Democratic donors, people from the Clinton team, essentially threatened to 25th Amendment him in order to get him to step down from the nomination, which, by the way, Kamala Harris was actively a part of that, despite the fact that she pretends that this totally came out of nowhere. And even if you don't take that reporting seriously, even if you want to wait until we find out later how true that actually is, he was saying a week before he stepped down that it's going to be a comeback and he's not too old and he's ready to fight against the evil orange man.
Let me close with this. I know I'm not a young man. State the obvious. Well, I know. Well, I don't. Folks, I don't walk as easy as I used to. I don't speak as smoothly as I used to. I don't debate as well as I used to. But I know what I do know. I know how to tell the truth. I know right from wrong. And I know how to do this job. I know how to get things done. And I know, like millions of Americans know, when you get knocked down, you get back up.
So yeah, when you have someone who snaked her way into this position on the backs of the Black Lives Matter riots, who did an absolutely terrible job as vice president, gave Joe Biden nothing in terms of votes or support or anything like that, then turn around, post she initiating a coup against him, say that he and his staff aren't doing enough for her, aren't prioritizing the election over the country enough for her, obviously that's going to make the tensions that already exist much, much worse. I mean, look at this quote right here. The White House is lacking someone in the room thinking first and foremost about how things would affect the campaign, a source involved in the Harris-Walz campaign told Axios. As the Harris and Walz campaign grapples with a very close election, some within Harris's orbit have felt that the White House hasn't been calibrating the president's schedule and messaging in a way that she needs, Axios reported, citing 10 sources familiar, by the way. Now, a perfect example of what they're referencing right here is the fact that when Kamala Harris did her first live interview on The View, all of a sudden, despite the fact that he hadn't done this for a very long time, Joseph Biden went live at the White House and essentially contradicted the nonsense that Kamala Harris was putting forward about Ron DeSantis.
NBC is reporting Governor DeSantis is ignoring your calls on hurricanes, resources, and help. How does that hurt the situation here?
You know, moments of crisis, if nothing else, should really be the moment that anyone who calls themselves a leader says they're going to put politics aside and put the people first. People are in desperate need of support right now, and playing political games at this moment in these crisis situations, these are the height of emergency situations, is just utterly irresponsible, and it is selfish, and it is about political gamesmanship instead of doing the job that you took in.
So on The View, Kamala Harris was saying, oh, Ron DeSantis isn't taking my call, and it's partisan and political and all that. She called him selfish. Ron DeSantis absolutely obliterated her, pointing out more than a few things. First and foremost, that he was working with the president and he was working with FEMA, never had any issue with them. And the idea that him putting Floridians first over her campaign is selfish is ridiculous and absurd. But Kamala Harris decided to double down and triple down and say, oh, DeSantis bad, DeSantis evil, despite the fact that Joe Biden affirmed DeSantis' side of the conversation.
You and Governor DeSantis have been going back and forth, trading jabs over your attempt to check in. And ahead of the storm, you've called him selfish for not taking your calls. Now, he said this morning you've never called regarding any of the storms Florida has had since you've been vice president until apparently now, and called it political. What's your response to that?
The governor of Florida has been cooperative. He said he's gotten all that he needs. I talked to him again yesterday. And I said, I said, no, you're doing a great job. It's all being done well. We thank you for it. And I literally gave my personal phone number to call. So I don't know. There was a rough start in some places, but every governor from Florida to North Carolina has been fully cooperative and supportive and acknowledged what this team is doing. And they're doing an incredible job. But we got a lot more to do.
Well, first of all, I have called and talked with, in the course of this crisis, this most recent crisis, Democrat and Republican governors. Called, taken the call, answered the call, had a conversation. So obviously, this is not an issue that is about partisanship or politics for certain leaders, but maybe is for others.
And again, I will point out that Biden did this at the same time that Kamala Harris was live. He signaled that DeSantis was correct while she was lying about him on The View. It's absolutely amazing. And again, considering Biden's schedule is very much dictated by the people around him, to me, this is not surprising. Maybe it's a little surprising that Biden uttered those words because you never know what he's going to say, but this was a moment of honesty from him. And by the way, DeSantis called Kamala out and said that she never called him in the 3 years for any storm that she was VP leading up to this point in time, up until the election, and Kamala actually confirmed that on The View, so both interviews made her look absolutely terrible, Biden's press conference and her on The View. Now, even though that press conference pissed off a lot of people in the Harris campaign, the Biden staff has been saying repeatedly that they've been good soldiers in this department, and honestly, it's totally out of pocket for Kamala Harris to attack him in this way. Let me read you the quote. "We have made a significant amount of changes to guarantee the vice president's team has all the support and resources they need," Bates argued, crediting the White House for successfully executing an unprecedented transition to a new campaign. Now, this article goes to point out that Joe Biden actually sided with Harris against other people in the Democratic Party in terms of whether or not they were going to have a mini primary in order to secure the nomination for her. And considering that Biden was forced out in this way, for him to do that, if that's true, is a big boon to Kamala Harris, because as I said before, and I will say it again, this woman would have never won any version of a Democratic primary. She got no votes, dropped out before the first state, before the Iowa caucuses in 2020, and was one of the most unpopular vice presidents in the history of the country prior to the media propaganda campaign to pretend that she's the next Obama. So Biden has done everything for Kamala Harris, and yes, there are people in the Biden team that are upset that she's trying to distance herself from him, but the fact of the matter is, she would not be here but for the grace of Joe Biden, but for the fact that he ended up picking her, because nobody would have chosen her in any way, shape, or form to be in this position.
I can imagine what can be and be unburdened by what has been, you know?
What can be unburdened by what has been? What can be unburdened by what has been? What can be unburdened by what has been? What can be unburdened by what has been?
What we can see, what we believe can be unburdened by what has been.
What can be unburdened by what has been? What can be unburdened by what has been? What can be unburdened by what has been?
What can be unburdened by what has been.
Who we can be unburdened by who we have been. What can be unburdened by what has been?
Where we can be unburdened by where we have been and unburdened by where we are right now.
What can be unburdened by what has been? What can be unburdened by what has been? What can be unburdened by what has been?
Now it says, despite subsequent White House staffers being alienated by the Democratic revolt that led to the bowing out of the race of Joe Biden, some have opted to jump ship to Harris's campaign. A White House official familiar with the dynamic told the Post that Biden's team recognizes, quote, that the VP and her team need the independents to run the campaign on their terms, and our goal is to provide support when helpful. That official contended that the Harris-Biden administration is doing what it can, quote, within the rules to ensure coordination between the office of the vice presidency, the White House, and the Harris-Walz campaign. Several steps the White House has taken for the coordination include having the vice presidential staffers sit on strategic meetings and working to accommodate Harris's travel schedule, according to that official. Now, it's very important for you guys to understand that the Biden administration is also trying to walk a fine line, walk the razor's edge hedge between campaigning and official White House duties, but it seems like they're going right up to that line in order to help Harris, and we've seen her get an increase in vice presidential staff on the government side, as well as an increase in campaign staff going from the Biden team, in addition to the fact that they're also giving her additional meetings and additional duties to make it look like she's doing stuff to help the American people. But of course, Kamala Harris is going to Kamala Harris, so she's blowing those opportunities. Remember the storm meeting where she was clearly and obviously being fed questions from members of her staff, and she had to tell them that it was live so that they would shut up.
Flood, we really got to watch those areas and those communities. So it takes quite a while for that water to drain.
Thank you very much.
Hey, Ken, I have a question for you. You mentioned words matter, and I know there's a lot of media following this briefing.
But one of the things that really pisses off the Harris team is the fact that you have these Biden loyalists within the White House that have called out Harris repeatedly and truthfully have told you what I've told you multiple times, that she is a worse candidate than Joe Biden in every possible way. Famously, amid that revolt against Biden, Deputy Campaign Manager Rob Flaherty strongly insinuated that the alternatives to him were less likely to defeat former President Donald Trump. Quote, at the end of the day, we'd switch to candidates who would, according to the polls, be less likely to win than Joe Biden. The only person to ever beat Donald Trump, Flaherty wrote at the time. To date, Harris has staunchly resisted pressure from top party strategists who have implored her to publicly draw a contrast between her policies and the unpopular Biden. Now, as of right now, Harris has basically completely failed in making herself seem distinct from Joe Biden in terms of policies, and one of the reasons why she's having difficulty doing that is because it's actually much easier said than done, because Kamala Harris is already getting hit when it comes to the border, when it comes to any of the policies that she's proposing right now, with questions of why she hasn't moved in that direction as VP, why she has been basically a ghost for 3.5 years until she stole the nomination, and why she hasn't been advocating for her agenda or pushing for her agenda in any way, shape, or form while in office. So she further distances herself from Joe Biden and ends up making the mistake and distancing herself from something that she voted for as the tie-breaking vote in the Senate to help Joe Biden. She's going to bury herself even further. On top of that, whatever you think of Joe Biden and his unpopularity at this moment in time, disloyalty, which is what that would be, that Harris would show on the stage, would definitely negatively impact her because she's throwing everybody under the bus when convenient, and this could also lead to further escalation from the Biden team against Harris. I mean, again, there's that iconic photo of Biden wearing the MAGA hat, and everybody laughed at it because it's so ridiculous, but the fact of the matter is, that might actually be a better representation of what the core Biden team wants the outcome to be than anything. Look, what you guys need to understand is that Harris was never liked by Biden nor the Biden team. They always wanted her off the ticket. They never wanted her to be the VP. And then when she took it a step further and stole the nomination from Joe Biden, that's when these divisions became far more divisive or far more grand in terms of scale. So there's a lot of people on the Biden team in their core group that don't want Harris to win because Biden is undefeated in general elections. He's the only person to beat Trump. And if Harris loses, Joe Biden will be the only person to beat Trump ever. And despite what they tell you about threats to democracy and the fall of the republic and all that, the fact of the matter is that they all know that Trump has already been president for 4 years and the country was perfectly fine. In fact, in a lot of ways, the country did much better than under the Biden years. But of course, one of the core tenets of Kamala Harris and her whole entire wokerati campaign is that they can never take accountability for their own actions. They can never take accountability for their own failures. So they've decided to turn the knives on Joe Biden once again to throw him under the bus, because if she loses, she's going to go out of her way to say it's all on Biden, even though in reality she's losing under her own accord. But you know what? Those are just my thoughts. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. If you like the video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on my social medias, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about Biden versus Harris. Till next time.